Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar, Why Most Migration Projects Fail. Don't be a statistic. We'll be going through the statistics of migration projects' failure points and giving some well-researched information about migration projects and their struggles, let's say. Just quickly, first as an introduction, my name is Robert Pittock. I am Vice President of Channel and Business Development here at Concept Searching. And I've been working with information management for well over 15 years now. I've done a number of migration projects and been involved for the previous companies that I worked for in migration projects and seen a lot of the issues with migration projects. A lot of that is anecdotal, and I hear it all the time. As board member of the Vancouver SharePoint User Group, we have quite a lot of discussions about migrations and their failures. So I have some anecdotal information to share with you as well, but the purpose of this presentation is to talk about the failure points and give you some options of how to avoid those, and that is really well researched. So you'll see a lot of statistics in this presentation, and I'll go through those each. Now I'd like to have Mike Pay, my colleague, introduce himself. Mike?
Thanks, Robert. So as Robert just said, my name is Michael Pay. I'm the CTO at Concept Searching. I've been with Concept Searching now for a little over 5 years, based out of the UK. And what we tend to focus on is driving the functionality in the product that can really make it easier for end users, for our existing clients and for new clients, looking for auto-classification technology to either drive improved search or as this particular webinar will demonstrate, improved migration experience. Back to you, Robert.
Great, thanks, Mike. So quick agenda. First of all, of course, this is a vendor-sponsored webinar, so I'd like to talk about who we are and what we do. We'll also be doing a few demonstrations of our product and how they address the particular failure points through the webinar. I hope those are not too distracting for you and you get good value out of them and you see why we're holding this webinar. But yeah, just a heads up that we will do those. Also, you will notice that our slides are very wordy. We're not expecting you to read them all. Afterwards, we will redistribute them, and hopefully the terms on the slides will allow you to remember a little bit easier of what we talked about, and then it'll be a little more informative that way. So what we're going to do is first talk about what we do. Then I'll talk about success rates of migration projects. We'll talk about business requirements to do a migration project, and some best practices around data profiling. We'll talk about what that is and what that means for most organizations. There's a slide about how long it's going to take. We'll also talk about records management, cloud migration, and metadata, of course, is our passion, and auto-classification. The process around migration. And finally, I'll end with a case study, and that's a large organization that we helped during the migration, and of course one of our massive success stories. But I'll tell you a little bit about what they did and how they managed to make that success. And finally, some takeaways. So let me just jump into quickly, I'll try to run through this quickly as possible, about our company, who we are at Concept Searching. So we've been around since 2002. And for those of you who don't know us, we are a concept classification company that builds an engine for concept classification. We were the first to the market with a solution that automatically applies semantic metadata. We're also the only solution in the market with a fully integrated statistical multi-term auto-classification platform. That's a mouthful, huh? Which we use to deliver metadata-driven search and governance solutions. We have been a managed Microsoft partner since 2008, and we're only one of 11 search partners worldwide who is a Microsoft Business Critical SharePoint program partner. Our product platform delivers metadata-driven search and governance solutions for all versions of SharePoint on-premise from 2007 onwards. We also support a number of other systems, and you can really see our software as more of, let's say, a metadata bus as opposed to just a classification tool for SharePoint. We support Box and OpenText, file shares, Exchange, SharePoint Online, and a number of other systems. So if you have some systems that are working that you need to do stuff for, ask us and we'll see if we can accommodate you. So how does it work? What do we actually do with content? Our platform is a semantic metadata engine, and it auto-classifies and applies taxonomy to content automatically. It's an infrastructure platform that works with a number of different systems to look at the content, largely unstructured content. It also can work with structured content and apply that metadata to it. The resulting classification that you get from this can add deep value to the content that you have, improving search, allowing users to sort and find information, flattening folders and hierarchies. The actual details of how we do this roll up to a unique approach that we have, which is compound term processing. So the way that our engine looks at terms is a lot different than what other vendors may use or other systems may use to try to find information. And it is unique still in the market in this way. We look at terms as phrases in their whole and find meaning in those phrases, not just from a single term. So you can see in this example, the words triple, heart, and bypass all have their own meaning. They all mean one thing: 3, an organ, or maybe the center in some cases. On bypass could be a highway or just going around any kind of thing or avoiding some kinds of things. But together, they have a medical meaning that is unique. And being able to find phrases like this, and those phrases are unique to your organization. Every organization's corpus has its own language, its own jargon that is often phrase-based. So being able to identify those and tag your content with those phrases in mind is an extremely valuable and powerfully effective way to organize information and tag it. So with that said, that's enough about our company and our technology at this point. I would like to go to the actual information that we want to deliver, and that is the statistics really about migration and their failure points. And hopefully at the end of this presentation, you will be able to go away with some understanding of the failure points and, statistically speaking, at least things that you should try to work on or avoid. One thing that I forgot to mention is that if you have questions, we'd love to address them, but we will address them at the end of the presentation. So just throw them in the chat anytime or in the question panel anytime during the presentation, and we will go through them at the end. That would be great. Thanks. So what's the success rate of migrations? It's pretty dismal. Only 16% of migration projects were on time and on budget. Now this research and all of the research that comes in this presentation comes from different sources, and we've tried to reference those here so you can go down and look at these particular references directly yourself. So not great. And these migration projects are not just related to SharePoint. Maybe many of you have come here because you know that we work well with SharePoint, but they're a large scope, any kind of migration that could come from one thing to another. 64%, largely the majority of these, were late. People really don't plan the time out well for these kinds of things. And more than half of the survey respondents really considered scoping was the biggest issue. The big takeaway, and I'm going to mention this a few times, is that really you should look at migration as an opportunity. So this is a chance for you to look at your content, find out what it is, what you can keep, what you can get rid of, what needs to be moved, how that's going to address the business, and then make a success of it. So don't look at it as just a daunting project. I know all of us who've been through a migration project, and probably that's all of us, considering we're at a maturity level in IT now that we've been through a few systems. We know it's a daunting process, but you really shouldn't look at it that way. You should look at it as an opportunity that, if well planned out, can give you a lot of value. And I'll talk about how that is going to be later on. So let's talk about large-scale projects. Small-scale projects are a major failure when it comes to migration, but large-scale projects have even lower success rates. Only 16% of these did not have a problem or were successful without issues. Most of them were over budget. Almost all of them were over time. And really the question comes down to this is, if you have a larger scale project, how can we avoid that? How can we avoid not going over time and budget with these? Really, it's easier to go over budget and have a failure than it is to not. So we really need to make sure that we know what it is we're doing before we start these projects. So that leads us to the next slide. What are our business requirements for these? And there are some critical first steps that we found through our research that you should identify first. And maybe the most important thing is knowing your data. Identifying what information you have. Probably there's a lot of file shares, there's a lot of older systems, there's maybe even information on people's desktops. There's certainly information that is important that's in things like email that you haven't even considered to move. But knowing what all that information is can really help you to determine where you're going to take that information. And that really leads you to determining what you may need to migrate and how your business is using the information. I have, in previous companies, quoted projects for migration where the organization just came to me and said, we're just going to move everything from A, in this case it was SharePoint 2007, to B, SharePoint 2013, just anecdotally. And we asked them, well, don't you want to do some cleanup first? Don't you want to, reorganize? Don't you want to redesign as you go along? And the answer was just flat no. No. Just move it all. Because the conception there was that this would be a faster way of doing the project. But that's really a failure in the opportunity that you have when you do a migration project. The opportunity there is to do cleanup, to remove yourself of this unnecessary data, and asking your business users what they need the information for is really a great first step. Go through, find out what they have, then find out why they're using it, why they're creating it, and what they need it. In many cases, you may find that they don't need it at all, and they may not even know what it is. Other things you can do is find out that there's a lot of information or a lot of data, let's not even call it information, it may just be things like zip files and executables and things that you can just get rid of. And of course, you need to consider how to maintain your business while you're doing this migration, because there's never a lights off, lights on scenario when you do a migration. There may be business processes that are happening during the migration that need to continue to happen, and you need to understand how that's going to work during the migration, because the migration is not an overnight process. Some organizations may try to do it in one day, but generally speaking, and this also is affected by the size of the organization, it's going to be a multi-week process where you move content and then have to do a delta on that content if things have changed in the old system. And you can consider your tolerance for that with your business users. You also, of course, need to consider who needs access to what information. And how that information is used. And there's a bunch of questions you can ask here. There also is a document that the AIM group has published with a bunch of questions about data cleanup. And I'll share that in the chat at the end, because I think that there's some valuable questions in there as well that you can look at, especially when, like I said, you're considering data cleanup, which is also part of the migration process. So there's a lot of information out there from experts about migration, and many of them, almost all of them, can accept and understand and agree that finding out what your information is really a critical first step. And we're really calling that data profiling. So we have some best practices here for data profiling. Most companies don't use data profiling. So by data profiling, what I mean is finding out, giving information, giving metadata to your data, finding out what it is. Most organizations just do that by hand. So they'll say, we have got some metadata capable in our system. We can apply properties to this data, and we'll just let our users do that. Maybe we'll give them a pop-up window when they upload a document, and that pop-up window will require them to add some metadata. We'll make it easy for them. We'll give them a drop-down list, and then they can put in their metadata there. And then we'll call that hand coding. Sometimes they have to type in things, and sometimes they can just choose. Generally speaking, this is how most organizations do it. It says here that only 10% actually do data profiling, so most people have no idea what their information is about outside of the documents. But those that do just say, let's make our users do it. And this really does not work, because what you're going to find is your end users are putting anything in those fields, ASDF, or they're choosing the first item. And this really leads to junk data. We've got metadata on our content now, but it's not. And I can understand why. The information workers that are doing their job are not records managers. They're not data classification experts. They're not taxonomists. Why are they being expected to organize the information in the organization? And you can make this as easy as possible for end users. If it's not their core responsibility, they're not going to do it properly. So we really need to automate that process. Funny cartoon here from Dilbert. I love Dilbert. Saying, you know, all our metadata is wrong. So how are we going to use that to add value to our organization? So continuing with best practice. When you're actually going through the migration, these are some things that you can consider if you know what your data is. What is the content that you're moving? And what can we get rid of? So data cleanup, like I mentioned, I'll shoot those questions up in the end about cleanup. What can we get rid of? And there's probably a lot you can get rid of. You can do a ROT analysis of it. You can actually regroup it. One of the big issues that a lot of organizations have is they have a lot of data, but it's actually almost too secure, and people can't find it. Or it's not properly grouped. Maybe on a file share, you have it in deep folders, and then you haven't grouped it well. So being able to regroup it as you move it is a good thing. Some content is just poorly tagged and needs to get new metadata, so you can go through and tag that. And of course, data could be volatile. That means that it could need to be removed, or it's no longer relevant, and we need to get rid of that, or maybe keep it updated. So now I'm going to ask Mike Payne to actually show us a demo of what concept searching does for term extraction and identifying sensitive information. And this is really the first step that we see in this process. So I'll just make you presenter, Mike. We'll swap over.
Thank you, Robert. Okay. So hopefully all of you can now see the interface that we provide as a company. So this particular interface is really geared to what Robert was just speaking about in terms of profiling data. One of the largest problems when you're trying to identify records and identify content is that the most typical way it's exposed to you is either through, as Robert said, invalid tags, or it's exposed in the way that you might search for a single word. And the problem with keyword searches, as everyone knows, is that typically you'll either find documents that perhaps you shouldn't be finding because it just has the word in there once, and actually that word, while important, isn't as important as other words. The other problem is you miss out on the documents that contain similar words or words that are related but aren't in that document. So what we provide with concept searching is a way in which you can profile your data, extract the significantly relevant terms and phrases, in particular the compound term metadata within the document, and we can use that to automatically profile our data. So this means that we don't have to have IT experts trying to find our data using some complex algorithm. We simply get our subject knowledge experts to look at a particular set of data, tell us what a particular word or a phrase or something they care about is, and then we can use the concept searching index to pull out the keywords and phrases that will allow us to find all of the content that we need to profile. And this could let us find, in this case we've got on the screen, environmental documents, or we could be looking at financial reports, which we'll look at in a moment, or we might be looking at something that's perhaps more sensitive, so we could be looking for Visa card numbers or addresses. And it's using all of the sort of different techniques that we provide in our toolset to be able to find the content in a way that end users just couldn't possibly do over the size corpuses that we're talking about. So I'm going to demonstrate now for environment as a very simple example. So if I search for the word environment, I get back quite a lot of content. I've got lots and lots of documents, but I think the key thing is that while all of these documents contain environment, there are lots of other words and phrases within them that are relevant to that subject, but aren't necessarily then picking up the other documents that don't contain the word environment. So what we do is select some of these documents, the most relevant ones that we found, and we click Suggest. And this does a reverse analysis on our search index, and it pulls in lots of information that we can find that actually might be about the environment, but don't necessarily contain the word environment. So we've got Environment Act, which obviously does contain the word environment. We have Noise Act, which again would be something of environmental concern. We have Clean Neighborhoods, Litter Clearing, Natural Environment, again contains the word environment. But what we can be doing when we're looking for these compound terms instead of the individual word is placing a higher weighting on the compound term rather than the single word. And the reason this is really beneficial for us is that an individual word, as mentioned in one of the earlier slides, can be quite ambiguous. So if we take the compound terms and use those with a higher weighting, then we can really narrow and focus in on the data we care about. So the way that we provide that in our rule set so that our knowledge experts can build these rules without much intervention of the IT team is we provide a scoring system. And the scoring system is used so that we can place a burden of proof on what we're looking for. So the higher the score, the less we need to identify that document as about that subject. And the lower the score, then the more accurate perhaps we're being with our classifications. So if we've got lots and lots of rules with low scores, what we're saying is, I don't just want one word to appear in it, I want this piece of information to appear and also this piece of information. So we'll select another one of these and then we'll click Add Selected. So what that then does is that adds in all of my rules with an automated ranking based on how statistically relevant those were in our document sets. And what we can now do using the concept searching tools is review what we've done. So we can say Browse, and then we can take a look at some calculations. So we can see exactly why that document is being tagged as environment. And in this case, actually, it just contains the word environment. But we can, if we go back and we select one of the other ones, if we select Litter Clearing, we can see some calculations here. We've got a number of different words and phrases appearing. So what the knowledge experts can then do is review the scores and review the phrases that we're using to identify our content to really hone in on the documents we actually care about. And this is particularly important for records management. So what we might also want to do with our rules is identify other particular information, not just the words and phrases. This is particularly relevant for some of the latest legislation that's coming out, things like GDPR out of the EU. So we might want to be looking at metadata rules, looking for exactly who wrote the document, who owns the document, who's editing the document. And we can use metadata clues to say, well, the author of this document, if it matches Joe Bloggs, that's something I need to know about, particularly if he's written that document and it contains some of this content and it's in this location. So we can combine lots of different rules to be able to find our content. One of the things we also support is the identification of sensitive information. So the way we might do that is use regular expressions. So we've got a fairly complex expression here, but what that allows us to do is say, not only am I going to pin my records ID identifiers automatically, but I'm also going to pick up any sensitive information that perhaps isn't in the correct location. And then I can perform some action on that. And in the case of what we're talking about today, that's our optimized migration. So what this really means for us is that we don't have to take all of our content and throw it onto the cloud. We can really pinpoint the exact information that needs to be migrated, and importantly, what information shouldn't be migrated, because perhaps we shouldn't be taking our sensitive information that we've kept in our on-premise repositories and putting it into the cloud. So what we can do is profile all of our data automatically based on a fairly small set of data initially, then apply that to all of our 10 million documents, and really minimize the amount of effort that the end user has to do. I'm quite conscious of the time that we're at now, so I'm going to hand back to Robert, who's going to talk a little bit more, and then we'll be back on a demo to actually see how these classifications can be used in action, looking at some of the documents that end users might be either editing or uploading to SharePoint.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to actually talk a lot more. Just kidding. I'll try to also be conscious of our time as well, and the people's time on the call. So excellent, and as Mike alluded to, the next step is really content optimization. After we figured out what we have, we need to optimize that content, and this will really help us to do things like Mike was talking about, avoid moving unnecessary stuff to the cloud. Some more statistics, and these come from a number of different studies. Really, it boils down to that only 25% of the content that most organizations have has any current business value. CGOC claims that 69% of data is obsolete and should be deleted. eLaw thinks that 60% is obsolete. So that's a lot of content that is maybe too old or has no business value and should be gotten rid of. A lot of organizations will keep that data because they think there could be value in that. Let's put a search against it, and then maybe some user can bring it up. But really, if you don't know what that data is and you're searching it, it can have a lot of costs. You're adding noise to your search engine. You are putting a lot of load on your search crawlers, and you're really giving people back stuff that they don't need. So really the key is to find out what that information is and then decide what to do with it. There's huge costs to this, and workers spend a lot of time just recreating information and wading through information that is irrelevant. So what do you do with this? Well, how do you do this content optimization? Well, really, there's a number of steps to it, and one of them is deduplication. So let's get rid of redundant data. Look through and find things that are the same all across and get rid of it. Also, you can do versioning. Do we need all of these old versions of this document? Can we get them together into one version that has some kind of optimized storage method? Can we identify records? Maybe this is a big scare that organizations have is, well, we could have records. We can't, but for compliance reasons, delete anything because there could be a record somewhere in there. And if you identify the records and you're confident with that, then that doesn't become a problem, and you can really alleviate yourself of a lot of that stuff. You could have security vulnerabilities, personally identifying information, all of this stuff in this massive pile that is stopping you from getting rid of that 60 to 69% of junk in your organization. Really, you need to surface that and find out what all of that is, and then eliminate redundant, obsolete, and trivial content. And meet your compliance requirements. Now, I mentioned briefly records. Records is something that I have some experience in. And this is really a big concern for organizations. Do we have records? What are our compliance requirements to store these records? And most people don't know, and they're really holding them back. A lot of solutions out there, and they're calling themselves best-of-breed solutions, are telling you how you should handle records. And really all they're talking about is how they're going to dispose of your records, how they're going to hold and dispose of your records, not whether you have records or what items those records are. And these solutions actually become an issue for you during your migration because they become a cumbersome part, something that requires a lot of maintenance and may not migrate properly. I recently talked to an organization who had set across the budget for doing a migration, and just the fact that they had a particular vendor installed meant that they were never going to make that budget. I knew immediately that their whole budget would be eaten just by trying to maintain that vendor solution. So really the key to records is to find out what is a record. That's really the most difficult part, and asking your users to become records classification managers is unrealistic. So we need to go through and figure out how we can identify records and make them records, and then trust the systems to hold those records. And that really is a minor, it's the end point, if you will, in records management. The starting point is really trying to figure out what is a record and then find out what to do with it afterwards. So with that said, I'm going to ask Mike to speak to this particular slide and then do a short demo on it. So Mike.
Thank you, Robert. So one of the most fundamental problems we see with records management is a lack of standards. Records have to have a unique system identifier, but it's been up to the vendor to basically choose what format that identifier is taken. And they've had to have a permissions model, but what functions and roles they set up, again, was down to the vendor. Now, the problem with content migration is it's not specific to record systems. It's a universal problem that affects any organization wishing to move content from any kind of application to another application. And difficulties in migrating can hamper our ability to manage content over time. So we know that applications have a shelf life, and after a period of years, a new application will come along that can do the same job better or cheaper potentially. So we're going to want to move to the new tool. The problem is that we have our various retention periods for our business records, and these typically will exceed the shelf life of applications, or definitely the shelf life of each version of an application. You know, looking at the various iterations of SharePoint, it brings out a new release every 3 years. So from a records management world or an archives world, it's difficult to say exactly where it's going to come from, but it's likely that the solution will come from that area. If nothing else, because companies are going to need to come from that area. So the first generation of electronic records management system specifications, everything from US DoD standards to fairly generic standards, didn't attempt to tackle this problem. They told vendors what types of metadata to put into their products, but they didn't tell vendors how to implement that metadata. And that's one of the biggest problems we have. You know, we need to make this metadata consistent, and we need to do it in such a way that it can be applied consistently. So, Robert, would you mind just passing the control over to me, and we'll move on to that demo. Thank you. Okay. So we're going to look at how we can actually automate that process and make it easier to apply our auto classifications and thus automate the records management process, and ultimately then that leads us on to our optimized content migration. So what I've got here is a fairly typical SharePoint document library, and what I've got is a number of managed metadata columns across it, and all of those managed metadata columns are being auto-classified by concept searching. So what's happening is the documents are being downloaded, the content is being analyzed, and then metadata is being written back into the tags. And the key thing to realize here is that then that not only can concept searching tools perform actions on those documents, but other records management applications or workflow applications can take that metadata and perform what needs to be done. I think the other important takeaway obviously from this page right here is we can see a lot of tags being applied based on the content of the documents, and an end user is never going to be able to select all of these documents. As Robert mentioned earlier, what's likely to happen is they'll select the first item in the list, or they'll select a favorite item in the list that they have, or they'll leave it as the default value. So what we'll look at now is how these classifications can get into SharePoint and how the end user can benefit from these. So we're going to look at two different techniques that content can get into SharePoint. So the first one is what we would deem a bulk upload. So I'm going to take a few different documents here and I'm going to drag that in. And what happens during this process is events are fired off to the concept searching server, auto classification will happen in the background, and then whatever subsequent actions can take effect. But the other, and I think perhaps more important set of behavior occurs when an end user uploads a single document. Because when an end user uploads a single document, what they'll be presented with is the standard upload form from SharePoint. And it's this that presents the problem for a lot of users. We've got a lot of fields to fill in, and these kind of workers are normally very, very busy. So what they don't want to have to do is select the appropriate tags for the document. And as you can see, while I was talking there, concept searching has on the fly, taken that document back to the server, analyzed it, associated what it's about, and provided the metadata back. And importantly, what we can see here is that it's also tagged that this should be a record. So this is a document of record that we need to care about. And what that means is then a workflow product can pick that up and take that over and do whatever needs to be done with it and retain it for whatever period is needed. But the other important information is obviously the rest of the metadata can be used to perhaps pick the most relevant version or the most useful versions for our migration. So if we close that out then. So that's the general behavior that we're trying to provide with our auto classification rules. And you can see in the background there, while I was doing that single upload, the rest of the document have been auto tagged, and we can see a variety of rules that have been applied. So we've got our regular expression rules identifying that this particular one contains credit card numbers. And in the other documents, we're looking at more of the fuzzy matching, using the words and phrases and that compound term processing. So hopefully that demonstrates just how easy it can be once we've used our data profiling techniques to automatically tag our documents, perform our optimized migration or our optimized records management on that content. So I'm going to pass back on to Robert now.
Thanks, Mike. Super cool. So just wait to get presenter access back. Let's move on to cloud migration. Cloud migration, as many of you may know, if you're interested in the cloud and just working in the cloud in general, is really a unique beast. So we got some advice from founder of a company called Unigma, who is an expert in this area, and they do a lot of cloud work. His name is Kirill Bensonov, and he says that there are 6 unique areas for to consider when you're doing cloud migration. So I'll just go through these quickly. You can ask us later if you're interested about this more. Planning and assessment, of course, is really what we've been talking about. But you need to consider also that you're going to be running duplicate environments. So you can't just upgrade your on-premise system, that you'll need to have a cloud environment and a local environment. And sometimes, the term hybrid is quite popular now, these will sustain these environments. So that's a different consideration that you need to work about. You also need to think about staff training. Cloud environment is different than a local environment. They're going to access it differently. They're going to use it differently. And don't just think that you can put people into the cloud and expect it to work. You're going to need some training for your information workers to get used to the cloud environment. It's much different. What kind of third-party migration tools might you need? Now, these tools are going to be probably more necessary if you're moving to something like the cloud than if you're just doing a local upgrade of a local system or a moving of stuff into a local system. There are leases on these things, subscription models as opposed to licenses to consider, and you'll probably also need some kind of consulting because this is a system that you likely have no expertise in. So just those considers for the cloud. Now, something that I think is extremely interesting is mail, and most people use mail as their core collaboration tool. Let's not fool ourselves. People are sending emails more than they're using Yammer or SharePoint or Content Server or whatever it is you have. They're just sending mails back and forth, and they're moving stuff. About 90% of all the mails are junk, though, just like, oh, thanks, or hey, these kinds of messages. Can you help me with this? And they don't have actually good content. But a huge amount of an organization's important, critical information is still held in email, and we're still not thinking about what to do with it. So that is something that you should really consider. Can we do something with mail? Can we move mail out of the email system? In this case, we're talking about Exchange, and into a document management system, identifying things like records or just attachments and corporate information, and automatically getting it in. So we don't have to rely on our information workers again, just distributing this responsibility out to perhaps thousands of people, but just automatically get that stuff into our document management system. So one thing that is important, I won't go into this too much, but migration, and this is something you need to consider, is lossy. It's really something that you're going to, in any case, you're going to experience loss when you do a migration. Just like if you open an image file or you convert a music file, the end version is always going to be, just by modifying content, your end version is going to be less rich than your previous version, unless you do something about that. So for example, in the typical migration scenarios that I have been involved with, you will often lose your created dates when you do a migration. This is the biggest pain, as things like metadata gets left behind. Normally that's the biggest concern is dates. Sometimes it's other information. There are migration tools out there that will help you with this. It's often a lot of problems with them, but that is a big problem. It's really lossy. Auto classification can actually help in this, and it is an opportunity to bring governance to this information, to identify appropriate metadata and help you actually choose the way that you're going to migrate that content. Normalizing systems, doing rot analysis, cleanup can help you to get the exact information you need and make sure that you understand the metadata that needs to be moved. If, however, you don't have that luxury, metadata can be automatically repopulated in the target system if you need to, using a system like ours. So there's a lot of things there that can be considered. So big question, and part of the slide that we wanted to address is how long is this going to take? And really, I wish I had a better answer for you than this. We'll talk a little bit about our case study, which is really a best case scenario. But it depends, and there are a lot of factors that will determine how long it's going to take. One of the things that I meant to mention earlier that I haven't yet, but I want to tell you, is that you need to do your data profiling and content optimization before you make your migration plan, and then you'll get a better idea of how long it's going to take if you do that preliminary work. So you should plan out some time for that and then make your migration plan. A lot of things here, points here of things that consider when you're talking about how long it's going to take. The fact that content will need to be rewritten, content needs to be reorganized, maybe it's old, irrelevant, we've talked about that already, and don't underestimate how much it's going to take. Really give yourself a good view for how long it's going to take. There's a lot of things that you may need to consider during that process that if you don't consider can really kill the project. So with that said, I'd like to pass off to Mike for his final demonstration, where he will show us about how he can actually move content with concept searching technology. So Mike, I'll pass back off to you.
That's great. Thank you, Robert. So as Robert said, the last demonstration today is going to try and bring all of the aspects of what I've been demonstrating today together. So we're going to take some content into SharePoint. It's going to run over all of our analysis, all of our rules that we have to apply. And then what we're going to do is perform some actions. So I've got the actions defined here as my workflow rules. And what I'm doing is the first rule says I'm looking for personally identifiable information. And what that's going to do is take those documents with whatever they contain, and it's going to put them on a file system location. It's going to secure them. It's going to take them out of the cloud and move them away. And then it's going to delete the item from the cloud. So we've identified that it's sensitive and we don't want it there anymore. And the second action that we're going to do is we're going to identify financial reports. So we're using a lot of natural language here. We're looking for annual statement, we're looking for VAT, we're looking for tax, we're looking for financial statement, financial report. Lots of different words and phrases that we would expect to find in these type of documents. And we're going to take them and put them in a designated folder or a designated library within SharePoint. And then we're going to delete them again from the original location. So it's a bit like a drop-off library scenario where we would normally have manual experts coming in and looking at a document, tagging it, and then taking it to the appropriate location. But instead of having to expend all of that end-user effort, what we're doing is using our migration tools to optimize the process, identify the content, identify the records, and move them to the appropriate locations. So what we'll do now is upload those documents. So all of those documents now are going through the process of being uploaded to SharePoint. We can see we've got sort of annual report, and we've got a load of newsletters, and we've got some of the same documents we were looking at earlier in terms of the content. So once all of those have been uploaded to SharePoint, the process sat on the server will pick them up. It will run the process of taking the data, indexing it through our normal search index, auto-classifying it, and then performing that workflow action. While we wait for that to run, I'll wait for SharePoint to pick every document up, more to the point. So the key thing here is obviously that the quicker we can make this process, particularly in terms of if an end user has to do this and we've got sensitive information, it's not acceptable really for that sensitive information to even be there for 24 hours. So to have an end user doing this, particularly when you've then got to take into account holiday periods and sick leave, to have an end user doing this is just not acceptable, particularly when you look at the average cost of a data breach. And that's why having a content optimized migration flow makes everything that little bit easier for the company and makes everything a little bit safer as well. So if we refresh that library now, you should see a portion of the process is completed. Okay, so we can see here we've got most of the documents now being auto-classified, and I can actually see one of those documents has now disappeared. So if I come across the server, what we can see here is two of the documents disappeared. So two of the documents have been downloaded to our secure location, so we can put that on our file system and we know that it's now safe. What we could also do is then perhaps fire off an email to a data manager identifying the content has been found, removed and quarantined. And if we go back and refresh, hopefully the rest of the documents will have been processed and the final stage will have been completed, taking those financial reports and putting them in that designated library for them so that we know when we're looking for financial reports, we know exactly where to go from them and we don't have to trawl through all of our content in a single library, which, believe it or not, is something we do sometimes see, people having site collections with sort of 75,000 files in a single library, which does make it very difficult to know where your content is and what content you've got and how old it is. So again, we can see here our documents being moved over to financial reports and deleted from the shared documents library. So hopefully that demonstrates how easy the process can be and how quick it can be as well when you have your data profiling set up correctly. So I'm now going to pass back over to Robert to finish off the presentation.
Thanks, Mike. We're a couple minutes over, so I'll quickly go through the final, please. So just to set you at ease, we are almost finished. So I'll show my screen again. And I'll talk about the case study. I think this is a really interesting case study that we did with a global automotive organization. I think we're under NDA about the name, so I won't tell you, but they have 40,000 users that are connected to their information management system, which is SharePoint, and they've used SharePoint for a long time on premise, and then wanted to migrate things to Office 365. And they have 20 million documents, all sorts of different kinds of documents, including a lot of PLM documents and just regular PDF, Word, and stuff like that. So they had a couple of goals when they wanted to go through. They wanted to be able to find out what its information to move. They wanted to get rid of their on-premise servers, and they wanted to improve search. Search was really a big thing for them because they had a large number of documents. And they want to simplify access too. So they want to get information out of secured areas that was not supposed to be in there and secure information that was in open areas. So we did this study for them, and our project for them, and our eventual benefits was they managed to decommission 50 on-premise servers and reduce that to 5. We auto-classified all the content and made it searchable in the cloud, and then eased that access to the information by finding things that weren't secure and unsecuring them, and finding things that maybe had secure or personally identifying information or specific competitive information, and helping them secure that as well. So how did we do it? First of all, we created a taxonomy for them, and that taxonomy was designed for subject matter experts. It was supposed to be easy to use. We don't want a really complex records classification file plan. We wanted a taxonomy that was easy to use and a good starting point. Then we began our auto classification. We ran through classifying the documents based on rules that were built, as Mike showed you, in the system using our automatic clue generation. After that, we were able to actually update the taxonomy to a more appropriate taxonomy. So they went from an initial understanding of what their business needed to an understanding that was more in line with what their business did. Then we reiterated that content optimization, went through, checked for security breaches, identified records, and managed all of that to get to the cloud. And this eventually allowed them to index the content and get search that was working. The end goal, as I mentioned, is a reduction of 50 servers to 5 on-premise, everything else in the cloud. Immediately, they reported back to us that enterprise search and e-discovery worked much, much better. They were actually now able to find things. And all of this was accomplished in 2 weeks. Now, that wasn't the entire project time, of course. That was the time that it took them to migrate after they had done the work to identify the content and make a plan. So they were actually able to get on budget and on time and successfully migrate 20 million documents in that 2 weeks time, so into the cloud, which is really impressive. So finally, and just to wrap things up, I know we're a little bit over, and I don't want to take you past the being an hour, 1 hour mark, and we still have some questions to answer, but I want to give you some takeaways. And really the takeaway for all of these statistics is that if you don't plan, you plan to fail. So make a lot of planning, do analysis of your content before you make the migration plan, and you're going to save a lot of time and effort in the end process of the migration. It is really an opportunity to do a lot of things. You shouldn't look at migration as a daunting process, but a time to open up a dialogue and get things sorted once and for all in your organization and make your new system work better than your old system. So with that said, I'm going to wrap it up. I'd like to first of all thank Mike for joining me, and we'll take questions now, and I'll see what questions we have. I'll just open chat to see what we have in here, so please bear with me while I figure out my chatter. So, question we have, which third-party records management applications that integrate with SharePoint do you work with? Well, we have had official partnerships with some of these vendors, but really we're agnostic to them because luckily, they're all of them. I know all of them. One was recently acquired by another as well, so there's only really 3 out there, maybe 4, let's say, 4 serious competitors out there in that space. They all work on the premise that once content is recorded properly in SharePoint in this case, they can handle it, which is really the big gap because they don't handle it if it's not recorded properly. They don't have any idea what to do with it, right? But once they understand that it's a record, then those systems can process it. They have some peculiarities. Some work a little bit differently than other ones, and they have some value propositions to them, and I know them all well. So if you want to start a dialogue, I can definitely give you some advice about those tools, but we're really agnostic to it. What we're doing is we're feeding those systems with good information, and really they're more of an endpoint solution. They look at content that's already in SharePoint and then decide how long it should be kept and handle the disposition of that 7 years down the line. So we help you get that stuff organized initially and then let them do their job. Even out of the box, SharePoint can do that a certain amount, but you might have really detailed specific requirements that will require one of these other third-party vendors, and we'll work fine with any of them. Other questions? Okay, you mentioned ROT. What does that mean? Okay, so ROT analysis is something that is kind of in the cleanup stage of the process, and it means redundant, obsolete, and trivial. That's quite obvious. I think I did mention it by name. Maybe I didn't relate the two together, but you'll hear that term ROT quite a lot. And really it's deduplication, deleting old things that you no longer need, and getting rid of trivial stuff. What is this junk that we've got on here? You know, maybe it's a lot of old drafts that people never made in the end to actually be a document. Maybe it's versions, hundreds of old versions. I actually was at our SharePoint user group meeting a few weeks ago, and a great presentation by Jerry Brimcombe and Matt Newton about how they migrated a small credit union And one of the anecdotes I remember from it is they were saying that there was one file that they noticed was taking forever to upload, over 2 hours. It was some couple gigs, and they were trying to migrate it, which was basically just a scripted upload in their case. And they were curious as to why, and they found out that there were more than 300 versions of that document, which, of course, if they had done some profiling before, unfortunately, that would have been out of their budget probably to be able to have the tools to do that. But if they had done the profiling before, they would have found that and been able to cut that particular case. So so that was a lesson learned for them, that they could have avoided that if they had known about that document, but really they couldn't. So so yeah, redundant, obsolete, trivial. Get rid of that junk before you do the migration. Why are you moving your old stuff? You know, like if you're going to move from one house to the other, throw out the old stuff first and then move. Instead of moving your garbage to your new house, you wouldn't do that, would you? Other questions? Do we have them? Let me just have a look here. Looking in the chat. Question 2, how do you work with G Suite as well as Office 365? G Suite, Mike, do you know what that is?
Yeah, sure. So at the moment, no, we don't have an integration with the Google Suite. We're typically a Microsoft house.
We're calling that G Suite now.
That's their latest marketing name, I think. It's been for a
yeah,
little while.
No integration with Google, but of course full support for Office 365. So so yeah, great stuff, including Exchange in the cloud, right, Mike?
Correct, yes.
Next question. How accurate is the auto classification feature? This is a very good question. Mike, would you like to address the accuracy and maybe the timeline for improving that, or the process for improving that?
Sure. So the accuracy is an interesting one. At a very quick level, you will always, in my mind, receive a more accurate picture than when users select it. What I tend to say is, obviously, the more time you spend building up the rules, the more accurate it will be. It will never be 100% accurate, but what you'll tend to find is that if you, say, spend an hour on a term identifying exemplar content and identifying exceptions to that exemplar content, you'll receive a really high level of accuracy, somewhere in the sort of 95 to 100% region, depending on what sort of rules you have in play. But it ultimately comes down to the same question as normally search. So looking at precision versus recall. The more time you spend on it, the more precise it will be, but you might then potentially miss some documents that didn't quite reach it into the threshold of auto-classification. But we'd be happy to, if you'd like to reach out to us, we'd be happy to do a more catered demo and discuss that further.
Great, thanks. Well, we are out of time now, so I would like to thank everyone again for joining us. It's been a great pleasure to speak to you all today, and I hope that the webinar has given you value and been very valuable use of your time. For the final message, I just want to say that there's no need to really contact us about this. If you have questions, please do. But I will be in touch with each one of you afterwards just to check to make sure that you got the information properly and that you were happy with the time you spent with us today. So again, thank you very much, and that's the end.